Hello and good afternoon friends, welcome to the CEC EduSet live lecture. Dear friends, as you know that we are celebrating Digital India Week from July 1 to 7 July 2015, and it would give us immense pleasure to announce that CEC making immense contribution in the field of higher education with the help of digitization. I would like to tell you all that so far we have produced e-content on various subjects for the UG students, as well as some of the students are under construction that we are planning to produce e-content on those subjects. Also, we have a digital repository for the students. All the students who want our program definitely can ask us and can access us. We would love to provide them those lectures, those programs on the higher education, as well as we have live transmission of educational content which is telecasted at www.cec-ugc.nic.in, as well as on webcast.gov.in or at Vyas Live. So dear friends, without wasting any time, I would like to take this lecture forward. Dear friends, today in this lecture we are going to talk about nature of changes in international relations since the Second World War, and for this we have again with us in our studios Dr. Sushila Kaushik. Dr. Kaushik is a retired professor from a Department of Political Science, University of Delhi. So dear friends, let's take advantages from her experiences and try to understand this very topic today, that is nature of changes in international relations since the Second World War. So first of all, I would like to welcome our guest Dr. Sushila Kaushik. Dr. Kaushik, welcome to the EduSet lecture. So as we are discussing lots on international relations, and this is the another lecture on international relations.
Yes.
So I would like you to take this lecture forward.
Yeah, thank you, Geetika. We have had one lecture before on India's foreign policy as such, called India and the World, but that was not on the international relations as such. We only focused on India. But when we study India, or for that matter any country, we must know the context in which we are moving, because this is something which is to do with the external affairs, foreign relations. But even for the domestic politics, it is better that you situate a country in the context of the entire international and world politics. So one should have a certain basic view about what is the way the world is constituted right now, particularly from the point of view of power politics and the relationship among the nations. We in the present government particularly very concerned about this sort of relationship with the external world, and our present government has been doing a lot by way of connecting ourselves with the various parts of the world in the past year or more. So we will take up in this the nature of the world politics and international politics relations portion in this, and as a reference point I am going back to the Second World War. This because it's a major event in the world international relations and world politics, and it's also something which made a difference between what was there before and what was there afterwards by way of the nature of the international relations. We find that before this Second World War, the politics was very different. It was more or less centering around some sort of a Cold War politics, some sort of a military politics. But after Second World War, there has happened many types of developments which has moved it away from the previous pattern. So we will see that in a very quick form and come back to the recent trends, the recent changes in a little greater detail as such. So when the Second World War finished in 1945, practically the world came to be divided, particularly Europe, Asia, and came to be divided into two big power blocks. The two power blocks then were known as the Communist bloc and the Free World bloc or Democratic bloc. One, the former led by Soviet Union and the later led by United States as such. So we had these two major powers coming into being, and that clearly showed as if the world is nothing more than just divided into two big blocks as such. Many of us did believe in this, and so we have this emergence of two major powers, and most of the other countries at least important countries, aligned themselves to either this or that by way of the two blocs. This happened essentially because during the Second World War, there was a big groups which came up. Germany and its allies came up as against the free world, and there it's United States towards the end, United States, Soviet Union, Britain, France, they fought together as an alliance, as an allied group against the German bloc. But once Germany was defeated and in Asia Japan was defeated, then we have really a different type of world which emerged at the end of it. Also in a way, the World War being one of the longest as well as one which cost enormous money and attention and loss to the world, we also began feeling very tired about the whole militarization, the whole emphasis on war, building up the army and things of that nature. So, we really wanted to move to a different world now where we will stress peace, coexistence and people pursuing other interests which was needed, most particularly economic development, scientific discoveries and things like this. This is where the Second World War made, the end of the Second World War made a real clear waterline. Namely, the defeat of Germany and Japan, who were militant, militaristic and wanted to expand their empire, their defeat led to a different sort of emphasis. But even then, we had another type of replacement which took place, the post-war negotiations witnessed once again the emergence of two blocs. Now, the two blocs which emerged as a result of the national interest and other things were again the Soviet bloc and the American bloc in name of communist ideology as well as the free democratic ideology. So, somehow after the Second World War was over, the ideologies began playing a very big role and we had two ideological blocs in the world as such. Though called as ideological blocs, basically the countries were pursuing what many international experts would say the notion of power and the notion of national interest. All countries definitely wanted to pursue the national interest, also wanted to pursue an aggregation of power and thereby also move into various other parts of the world. So, we practically the world looked like being divided into these two blocks, though ideology was the garb in which this division took place. In fact, ideology itself became a national interest. In the name of ideology, in the name of communism or in the name of democracy, these big blocs began moving around in the world trying to bring more and more countries under their tutelage, under their aegis. So, that is a different type of a ball game now than a militaristic or expansion or occupation of territory. That is the old game. The new game would have been to bring in more and more areas under their benign blessings in the name of what you call ideology or democracy or communism, whatever is the leading ideological blocs were there. But this ideology in turn divided the world into a bipolar world, two poles, the communist pole and the democratic pole, or American pole and the Soviet pole, and the relationship between these two bipoles, these two polar world was not really smooth. So, it is just not ideology, ideology combined with national interest and power politics. So, that led to what we call a Cold War politics. It was no longer an active war, it was no longer a militaristic war, though each of these two countries brought the Second World War on the basis of an atom bomb. America really brought the World War to an end by exploding atomic bombs in Japan, and then went further to discover the hydrogen bombs. So too the Soviet Union. So, there was definitely a military competition between the two, but by and large it was played out not in a hot arena, but more in the case of trying to capture the minds, the markets of the world for themselves. So, with the result, it became a Cold War politics. It is not a peaceful world, it was not a tension free world, it was still one where there were a lot of strains and stresses by way of relationship in the world, but there was no active war as such. It also led to two blocs, and so the countries began choosing which side they will want to belong to, particularly the European countries. So, with the result, the politics during this period, that is soon after 1945 and almost for next 10 years, decades, it was very much Eurocentric. Which countries of Europe belong where? Which countries of South America belong to United States bloc? You have a couple of countries like Cuba which went off to Soviet bloc because of the communist ideology. So, anyway, by and large, it was a Western countries, it was the European centered politics which was dominating the world as such. But this situation did not continue too long, could not have continued too long, because simultaneously there were also the emergence of other factors. Even during the Second World War, or in the interim period as we call interwar period, there were certain other developments which are taking place, most important being the nationalist movements all over the world, particularly in Asia and Africa and even in some parts of Latin America. You had the colonial empire cracking, you have the colonial people begin fighting for their liberation. So, almost everywhere there were nations which are fighting for their independence and liberation from the colonial empires. With the result, this has also in a way weakened the European powers. So, at the end of the Second World War, many of these countries began to emerge as independent nations or states with a very powerful new nationalism as such. This is also one of the reasons why some of the European powers no longer could fight on a strong footing, and reversely, because they lost the Second World War or became very weak at the end of the war, like Britain and France were completely economically weakened by the war, while Germany lost much of its empire after the war, that we find that these countries were emerging as independent nations by about 1947-48 onwards. India itself became independent in 1947. So, also very many countries of South Asia like Sri Lanka, Burma at that time became also to be liberated from the British colonial empire, and then partition took place. So, you have a Pakistan also emerging. Same is true about Africa. Many countries began to fight their liberation wars and were emerging quite powerful from the empires like the Congo, French, Brazil, and many other countries, Belgium, many other countries like that, which were European countries, had begun losing their hold over the colonial empire. So, there is a third entity which was emerging at the end of the Second World War, and this became what we call a third world. It neither belonged to the American world nor belonged to the Soviet world, neither was this ideology nor the other, but they emerged as independent nations and came to be called by way of a third world. So, whichever may be the first and the second world, we had the third world which is coming up, and these third world countries were not following any of these ideologies totally, but taking up whatever suited them from these two ideologies. Many of them were democratic countries, many of them took the principles of socialism from Soviet Union, equality, socialism and welfare state model, but many of them at the same time kept up the Western democratic values of equality and liberty, which they borrowed from the European nations or from United States as such. So, they were very different from either of them and emerged as a third bloc in the world. So, when they emerged as a third bloc, their foreign policy also became not aligned to any one of them. They neither wanted to belong to the Soviet bloc nor wanted to belong to the American or free democratic bloc or British bloc. So, many of them called themselves as non-aligned countries, not belong neutral countries, not belong to anybody, and preserving for themselves the right to decide on the issues on their merit their own foreign policy. So, which meant a certain amount of independent position on foreign policy, independent position on foreign relations, but coming together among themselves as a non-aligned group, because they were all young, they are all small, they are all economically backward, and so they joined up among themselves to pursue other aims like peaceful coexistence, economic development, as well as the development of the population socially. So, they had no use for the Cold War as such or Cold War politics as such. They wanted to be free from that sort of a politics. So, you have a new type of world emerging where you have three different types of worlds coming up. At the same time, we also had certain new actors who were emerging in the international field. One of the important actors who emerged as a result of this sort of a liberation movement or revolutionary movement in this case is China. China became a revolutionary country. It was also fighting almost from 1920s, but they finally became, the revolution came by 1949. So, with the Chinese Revolution, one of the largest countries in the world with the largest population in the world, it added a lot to the communist strength in the world. So, the presence of China, even though it belonged to the communist bloc of Soviet Union, still the presence of China by itself also became a very important factor to count after the 1950s. And that is where we began having a little wars. Even though everybody believed in peaceful coexistence and wanted to pursue their economic development, we witnessed some little wars, particularly in Asia, the Korean War of 1951, which finally led to the division of Korea into South and North, but essentially confrontation between the emerging communist revolutionary regime in China and the American forces in Korea. So, that is where we witnessed a certain portion of Cold War politics in Asia, not by Soviet Union, but its ally China as such. It had a lot of important implications for China's domestic conditions, the huge population, dense population needing more resources and needing more area, territory. The Korean War was a witness to the expansionist designs of China, its need for more area, and so it began sending its men, training them and sending them out in the form of wars. So, Korean War became a big landmark for Asia, Asian relationship. Though Communist China emerged in 49, by 51 we knew what could be the implications of a revolutionary big China to Asian politics as such. Then came the other important one, again it had started by 1946-47, but came to a fruition by about 1954. That is a Vietnamese struggle. Like India, which was also fighting national liberation movement and then finally became independent in 1947, the Vietnamese also have been resisting the French rule for a very long time, even from 1940s. And during the Second War, when the French attention went off to Europe and had become militarily and economically weaker, the Vietnamese struggle also picked up. So, you have a very strong Vietnamese struggle which went on till finally in 1954 Vietnam became an independent country. Though in the beginning a little partition between South and North Vietnam, much later led to a unification. So, you have a Vietnam as such. So, these were some of the small points of tension and strain in the Asian region as a result of the Cold War politics, which no longer were European centric, but which are moving somewhat to the Eastern Europe and Asia as such. So, even when Soviet Union was consolidating its gains in the Eastern Europe, its ally China was trying to do the same thing in the Asian portion, and so this is the Eastern Asia which had a little problem till about 1954-55 as such. So, this is a sort of a struggle which had implications for India. That is why we mentioned about the Vietnamese struggle and Chinese revolution and its expansion a little more. At the same time, the European nations which had moved from the war mind, because they have been thoroughly defeated and quite a bit of economic problems had come up. Many European countries, particularly the Western European countries like France, Italy, could not really cope up with the damages of the war and had to now look into building up their economy and strengthening themselves. So, Europe became quiet, but they had to pay attention to the economic recovery, in which they attempted with the help of United States, though it was also involved with the war, the least amount of damage, that US was emerging as a strong economic power which could help out Europe in its recovery. So they had the Marshall Plan, they had the European Recovery Program ERC, which in turn were heavily funded by United States, so that Western Europe like Britain, France could really, Italy could be built up again from where they were at the end of the Second World War. In the Eastern European side, similarly, Soviet Union took the lead, and once again it had got little damaged by the Second World War, but could easily recover, and then brought about all the countries in the Eastern Europe which had been liberated from Hitler's arms and from the war, once again coming together for an economic build-up, which is called the Warsaw Plan. So the Warsaw Pact was something which was led by Soviet Union, which essentially had membership from all the Eastern European countries, which are also coming out of the Second World War and the German occupation, so and which are also become ideologically leftist, communist bloc. So you had now attention moving on to the economic side of the new blocking system, not so much the military side, even though militarily Soviet Union or US also had thought of coming to their help if needed. But the priority was economic build-up of these countries. So it became a Eurocentric one. In Asia, as to see, we had these two small problems with Korea and Vietnam, but we also had countries which are coming out and which wanted to build themselves up economically and wanted to combine their strength, also get help from others. So that led to what you call Colombo Plan. Colombo Plan, because the meeting took place in Colombo. Colombo Plan, which had the support of a few Western countries like Canada, which were not part of the Second World War in a big way, and so they came to help us with the third world countries with peaceful coexistence and peaceful build up and economic recovery and economic development, because these countries are all coming out of backwardness under the colonial rule. So we had a Colombo Plan, which also again talked in terms of social and economic development in this particular area. So in general, the mind has moved from military to economic recovery, from building up war and defense to building up the economic development of the country world. So that was a positive development which began coming up after about a decade after the Second World War finished. But all this in the drop off, there is a Cold War continuing, there was strain continuing between the two big power blocks, but there was a third block which was focusing on economic problems and economic development rather than be lost in this ideology or in the militaristic plans as such. This example was in turn followed by in the various other parts of the world. So we had an ASEAN which came up in Southeast Asia, Far East, Asian Southeast Asia type of a plan or a pact or a group, which began building the economic recovery of this area. Similarly, you have one on Africa, you had one on Latin American countries, the countries in the region joining up together, not for military purposes, not for warlike purposes, not for expansionist purposes, but essentially to build a unity among themselves and then build themselves collectively together. So you have African Organization of African Unity, Organization of Latin American countries, and in South Asia, though little late, we also had the SAARC. SAARC is South Asian countries together. The 5 countries at that time gradually becoming now 7 countries who are members of the SAARC: Nepal, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Maldives. These 5 countries started, then now we even have 2 more countries joining. So we have the SAARC, which looks into only our common problems, our mutual problems, and our building up together, working out certain collective projects and collective programs with our own money and not getting any money from any of the bigger blocks in the world as such. The SAARC is still continuing very strong and acting as a place where we meet together and sort out our common issues, because geographically, ethnically, we have a lot of commonalities in this region. So we deal with a lot of our economic and other problems. and the aid for SAARC essentially comes from the SAARC countries, because having been under the colonial rule, one is really scared of getting more and more aid from them. So, SAARC was formed totally as an autonomous independent person among ourselves, while ASEAN gets a lot of aid from the United States, and there are other members like China and others who are also there. Along with these peaceful organizations, there are also attempts to build some military alliances, particularly in Europe, because the threat of the Cold War politics, the threat of ideological politics, the threat of Soviet Union again emerging as a very important challenger was very strong there. Particularly at the end of the Second World War, Germany had been divided and partitioned practically between the democratic West and the communist Soviet Union. The result is Germany became one democratic Germany and one communist Germany, Eastern Republic and the Western countries. That was always a sore point in the European relationship. So, the fear always was there. So, European nations joined up together to form what you call NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, much more military and much less economic. Whereas the other countries in the world, the smaller countries, went more for economics and very little for military, thinking in case they need it at any particular point, they can always go for help. India really had to do it after 1962, when we had the war with China. Before that, we also believed we do not need any military aid and we do not have to go to any country. But at that point, because of the attack, we also had to have a mutual friendship pact with Soviet Union. We also had to ask for arms aid from United States. But that was more on bilateral relations. It was not on a pact or alliance model as such. So, this in general, what has happened was by about 1960s and later, we had a world which was very different from the world which was there in 1945 when the World War finished. In the place of two bipolar or two just points which were acting as polar points like Soviet Union and United States, we now had a multipolar world. We didn't have there was a big chunk of the world which didn't belong to either of the two poles, and so the other countries were emerging, third world was emerging, lot of regional blocks were emerging, the regional powers were joining up among themselves, and also they were joining with the smaller countries in the region. So, there was an emergence of a few regional powers, like China became an important regional power, Japan became a regional power economically, India was emerging as a regional power more for its foreign policy postures, even if economically we were not very strong, and our ideology was a neutral Western ideology, liberal ideology as such. So, we had a lot of regional powers coming up here. Similarly, in West Asia, the countries were building themselves up and were emerging. And in Asia, of course, China and India became two emerging powers, of which China definitely took the lead, because it also had an aggressive foreign policy and a very strong military policy as such. So, China became a regional power even before we did, and we also had to move in along with them. So, while India did not believe in any great hegemonic relationship, we kept SAARC as a very cooperative entity as such, even though we were the biggest partners in the SAARC, a big power in South Asia and a larger country in South Asia. Our relationship was never in the form of being a regional power or a dominant power, whereas China definitely had emerged as a dominant power in South Asia, Southeast Asia. All the smaller countries in the Southeast Asia had to be really worried about Chinese expansionism, particularly after what happened in Korea, what happened in Vietnam, and much later after 1979, what happened in Cambodia and other places, Laos, Cambodia. For a long time, of course, these were more little fears in the Southeast Asia rather than any war, but the real small wars began taking place. So unlike the Second World War or unlike First World War, which are major wars which involved all the countries sooner or later, most of the countries, even small countries which were colonial areas of the bigger power, even they got involved in the Second and the First World War. Now the scenery was such where the big international war as such on a world scale was more or less ruled out, but there were a lot of skirmishes, a lot of what you call small wars, what a lot people called limited wars. The concept of limited wars came up. Korea was a limited war, Vietnam was a limited war, in the place of Cambodia there was a limited war between China and the countries. You had in Afghanistan a limited war, between proxy war between Soviet Union and United States, which has led to all the problems which today have in Afghanistan in a way after 1979. And in South Asia, there were a lot of limited wars between India and Pakistan, starting with almost 1962, and every now and then a little skirmishes here, little wars there, but all of them very, very limited, very short duration, and brought to an end with negotiations sooner or later. So none of us can afford in the world to have big wars, because fear of a Second World War or a Third World War was always haunting us, and the whole world understood if there is a Third World War, that no part of the world is going to survive the Third World War, because the difference between the previous and post Second War was, in the post Second War period we had the nuclear arms. Not merely United States and Soviet Union, but even France and Britain began acquiring nuclear arms. Following them, even small countries like Israel, China, now India, Pakistan, so many countries have acquired nuclear energy and nuclear bombs. They may not use it, but they all have it in their hands. So any war at any particular point of this nature will not be limited to territorial wars of the old type or a conventional war, as we call it. It can become a nuclear war, flare up into a nuclear war in no time, and in which case it will do enormous harm to a very big chunk of the world. And the other bigger world countries which are away, they may not know how to exactly save the world from the nuclear war as such. So the presence of a nuclear war is really a danger, an enormous danger, tremendous amount of tension, but at the same time it is also in a way a savior, because it is making every country a little more careful not to touch, not to go beyond a certain limit when they have any problems as such. So limited war in a way is the result of countries possessing nuclear sections. So in the Indo-Pakistan war, the Bangladesh emerged as a new country. So we have whole lot of countries now in the South Asian region which went now peacefully to make themselves their own economic build-up. So at the same time, there was also changes taking place in Europe. Europe now understood. They have given up military, they are concentrated on economic build-up. They found again and again the economic build-up means they are dependent on the United States. Especially the Western European countries were all dependent on the United States, and the Eastern European countries were all dependent on Soviet Union, and economic dependence also brings a certain amount of political strings and a little amount of foreign policy conditioning. Particularly Eastern European countries have found the interference of Soviet Union quite a lot in their domestic politics and ideology. You had a little bit of revolts, if not revolution, taking place in Eastern Europe. You have Czechoslovakia having an uprising, you have Yugoslavia dividing itself, and then lots of uprising there. So the Eastern Europe also began protesting against its ideological hegemony of Soviet Union. The Western Europe also had in a way began resenting, if not protesting, resenting the economic hegemony of the United States. So the result is these countries began to think themselves, how exactly can we make ourselves independent of this? The result was the European countries joining up together to form what you call European Union. This has been talked about for a very long time by very many international experts, but it took a long time before it could fructify into a union. So, now we have all the Western European countries joining up together to form what they call the European Unions, with their capital at Brussels. So, you have France, Germany, Italy and many other countries which are now members of European Union. They have gone far beyond what they thought. They now have a common coinage, they have a free travel, they have no visa between the countries, they stand by each other. Though each country maintains their independent entity and identity, they have given up on many issues for the sake of it. It is like a loose confederation which the European Union has, which has helped them a lot in cutting down a lot of costs, have free travel and develop a mindset which is not dependent anymore on the United States, and above all where they come to each other's help whenever there is any need. Presently, for instance, Greece is going through this tremendous problem of economic depression. The economy of Greece is collapsing very fast, but they are depending on European Union to bail them out. It has happened in the past. So too, from the point of view of democracy, the European Union has put a lot of conditions on preserving and protecting the democratic politics in Western Union countries, European Union countries. So, they come by each other, they monitor each other, they check each other, and they have the elections done very peacefully, fairly in the Western European countries, which is making them a whole lot of a democratic bloc, free bloc in the world as such. So, you have very many things happening during this period after 1970s and 80s. In Europe, you have a European Union which is throwing in a way a challenge to United States, because together it is quite a big strong entity. Together they can have a role and a say even in international politics and international economics. The Soviet Union, under all this pressure, by 1991 collapsed as one hegemonic big rule and split into as many countries as it had republics, or as a federal country it had 16 republics, which now became something like 16 countries. So, they also had lost that one bloc, just as America lost that one bloc in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, Soviet Union also lost it. So, the European map went through tremendous changes in 1990s after what you have the glasnost and perestroika in Soviet Union, which opened out Soviet Union completely to the various countries, and a liberalization emerged in the Eastern Europe. So, much of the politics of Europe, much of the politics of the Western countries even came to be evened out better. For instance, the Cuban Revolution also went through a change. Castro became old, Castro retired, then Cuba also began coming closer to United States. So, the Cold War politics there also has diluted a lot more now to emerge as Cuba emerging as another one of good neighbors of United States. But in the meanwhile, the world is now moving towards the east. So, we find that 20th century has become a Eurocentric, from being a Eurocentric politics into a Asia-centric politics. The 20th century, much of the events which are taking place are now taking place in Asia, particularly in West Asia and in the Eastern Asia as such. One important reason for it is the emergence of China as a very important economic power. Not so much China only as a military power, because we had China as a military power before, and throwing a challenge not merely to India, but to United States and even up to a certain extent to Soviet Union. But now China is also focusing on its economic strength and economic development, and even weakened its ideological strength to become more and more towards capitalism type of a philosophy and ideology. With the result, China is emerging as a good capitalist power as such in the economic growth, and is supplying the world markets all over the world, particularly definitely in the Western world and the Eastern world as such. So, this relationship with China then had to change. So US gradually changed its notions about China, its attitude to China. During President Nixon's time, Nixon went over to China, and that started the beginning of US-China relationship, particularly in the economic field, which gradually brought down the aggressive warlike Cold War politics between the two countries. The US also began looking differently at the Central Asia region, which originally for a long time remained as the British and French and their sort of domain during the Second World War. But after the war was over, when these Western countries moved out of this, then the local countries began coming, and you have Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran coming out as important powers away from the colonial grip, even though they were not colonial territories, but they were being exploited for oil by the Western empires. With the Western empires leaving them, these countries began asserting their own economic strength, and their biggest asset definitely was oil. So, a lot of oil diplomacy which had started, sometimes even oil wars which are played in a very limited way, and you have Iraq and Kuwait war in a very limited way, Iraq and Iran wars in limited way all the time, skirmishes. So, you have Western Asia emerging as an area which required attention in this particular century, in the 20th century. So, you have West Asia, every country bothered about West Asia, particularly US, which always looks for oil, which always is a big consumer of oil which it does not produce. So, with there is or enough is not produced. So, US began looking for its allies in West Asia. That is where the Afghanistan war of 1979 started, when US wanted to enter into Western Asia and displace in a way Soviet Union. So, you have oil diplomacy starting from West Asia. So, you have a lot of things happening in Asia, the Western powers getting involved and interested in Asia, particularly US, and Soviet Union withdrawing much from these areas because it was weakening inside, its federalism was loosening. Finally, it collapsed by way of a Soviet Union as such. Ideology became extremely weak, and so with the result, the Western Asia began to come on its own. The South Asia began coming on its own. The Southeast Asia began emerging as an area for future investment for these countries, and China emerging itself as a very strong power. Japan was a country which was defeated in the Second World War and was not allowed to have any military build-up. It was made neutralized. But Japan came up as a good economic power, manufacturing country, which continued to be there for a very long time. It also developed a lot of nuclear energy, but could not develop nuclear power as such. So, Japan also was an important manufacturing country supplying goods to the world. So, Asia became really an important arena in the 20th one, and there were a lot of issues came up on trade and other things, and United States and others began controlling the Asian markets and the Asian products manufacturing. So, you have various types of WTO and other types of economic unions which came up, G7, G9, G8, all types of things came up in the world, where oil producing countries joined up in the form of a new alliance called OPEC. You have industrialized countries coming together as G7 and G9. You have other countries coming up in the form of the labor unions and others coming up together to control the exploitation and other things in the form of world WTO, all of them coming up in the world and operating globally together rather than individually countries operating. So, the world scenario totally changed after this. So, in 20th century then we have a different type of a world, multicentric world, dispersed world, decentralized world, where while the war is receding to only being confined as limited wars, you have economic wars going up quite a lot, trade relationship picking up quite a lot, and for the sake of trade and economic relations, you begin having small wars which is also taking place all over. China was trying to have aggressive foreign policy, but soon it was told it cannot be. So, it stopped with Tibet, but was more now acquiring its own areas like Hong Kong, it had it. Now it's trying to get Taiwan to itself, because historically they were together, it was just a part of it. So, what is happening right now in the world is, one could just say it's a very fluid world. It has a lot of uncertainties, lot of limited world, where limited wars which need to be contained, but which need not create a threat to the world as such, especially in Eastern Europe and Western Asia. We also have a very important development recently, is the emergence of terrorism and the emergence of religious fundamentalism, which was not there before as such, but now all these countries coming up, particularly West Asian countries coming up with their oil wealth, and which suddenly is realizing historically they have been thoroughly exploited by the Western countries for their oil, and at the same time they have not been socially or economically, culturally developed, though economically they are very, very strong, but the world influence which they have is not proportionate to the economic strength which they have. As oil producing countries in the world, they could have had a lot more political influence in the world, but they did not have it because they were under the rule. So, now they are emerging and asserting themselves, and they are asserting it in the form of religion. So, you have a lot of Islamic fundamentalism, Islamic terrorism as you call, essentially trying to find the various Islamic countries together, the Muslim countries being brought together under the religion rather than on many other things, because economic development is not the problem for them as such. And the other very important recent development is the tremendous enhancement of technological knowledge, which is leading to, in a way, helping the positive side of the world development, but it is also negatively helping the fundamentalist forces to create crimes, to commit crimes in distant lands, have a terrorism, and trying to bring as many areas under their control as possible. So, not merely they are confining themselves to Western Asia, which is essentially Islamic area, but they are also trying to move to the Islamic islands in other countries of the world. So, with the result, we have the cyber crimes, cyberspace, technology, technology, as well as religious fundamentalism, which has got a sudden revival even among the developed sections of the world, is what is the biggest threat right now for the domestic as well as international relations right now. So, terrorism is emerging as a major cause of these various unions, various powers and various countries in the world. But the other thing is, so economics, trade, nuclear weapons, terrorism, religious fundamentalism are becoming the important negative features of the current world as such, not the fear of so much the second, third world war as such. Even the nuclear arms, with a certain amount of mature understanding of how to handle it, can be redirected to positive purposes. India is showing the way that nuclear energy need not be always for building nuclear bombs. Nuclear energy can be utilized for peaceful purposes, even by a small, economically undeveloped country like India. So, not merely the Western countries, but even we people are now talking in terms of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. So, if this is followed by many other small countries, then one will not merely develop fast, but also the fear of a nuclear weapon also will come down, war will come down as such. But these are all far reaching type of aims we have. Meanwhile, there is a lot of ifs and buts in the process. A small crisis here can topple the others. The neighborhood relationships may still be not that peaceful. You have the other thing, the global movement. The people are now moving, they are moving from country to country with the help of modern techniques, modern technology, and the world in fact has become a global world thanks to this modern computer digitalizing technology or computer technology. So, one is not very far away from where things are happening around. This has both the negative as well as the positive impact. In fact, terrorism fundamentalism could pick up mainly because of the technological advances which is taking place all over the world as such. At the same time, the neighborhood relationship also is extremely important. Even if the world has become global, world has become extremely united in many ways, understanding, still problems with the neighbors always seem to continue, particularly for us in South and Southeast Asia. So that's where the problems of Burma keeps coming up, the problem of Sri Lanka and the Tamils keep coming up in Sri Lanka, spoiling our problems. A relationship problem between India and Pakistan keeps coming up, spoiling our relationship every now and then. What happens in Nepal definitely is a concern for us in India, but so we find that even when things are moving big, the small things can also create problems and be irksome troubles for us. And for us in India, definitely the emergence of China as a big power in the Eastern Asian section is an important consideration. It's an important threat to both Southeast Asian countries as well as India as such, or even those countries in this region which are trying to build up alliances with China and trying to get a lot of support from China. China can be allies, China can give a lot of help, but China also will remain as a threat, because China has all the nuclear energy, China has all the economic energy, China is moving fast economic development wise, but that has not made China change itself completely. So Chinese military also is moving around. A couple of days back one heard about the Chinese Navy moving around the Indian Ocean. And so there is the old militaristic tendencies, aggressive postures, eagerness to occupy land in the neighborhood area remains as a concern for China. And as long as it remains as a concern for China, India has to worry about. And whether one likes it or not, India and China do seem to be competing for leadership role in Asia. This was an old saying which was there in 1940s and in 1950s and 60s, when India took a lead with the non-aligned world and third world countries. Now that world has practically now collapsed. There is no more any non-alignment, there is no more any neutrality, each one stands for oneself. The small world are coming up, stands for themselves. At the same time, they are also threatened by some of the big countries like China moving very fast. So once again, the old politics, the nature of old politics, will it come back is the issue. Because in the interwar period or even the post-war period, the most important concept in international relations was the balance of power politics. United States was balancing Soviet Union. Britain was balancing France before, and Britain and France were balancing Germany during the interwar period. So we had a balance of power politics, and that kept the other person under check. Do we have the same thing here? Do we have a balance of power politics in the world right now? That sort of a old notion of balance of power does not seem to function, even though very often India and China are poised against each other, particularly posed that way by others, saying they are trying to balance each other. But in the midst of all that, definitely as a result of the Cold War politics collapsing, Soviet Union collapsing, and the military and nuclear science getting a greater say, the United States definitely has emerged as a superpower. So on the one hand, we have a superpower in the United States, which under a good benign president can be good, but the superpower also plays for its own national interest. So we have the Iraqian politics, the Tehran politics, the Syrian politics, where the United States definitely plays a very important role. We also have the old balance of power politics between China and India in Asia for the smaller Asian countries. So we cannot say that all the old concepts have completely vanished. They are there, but in a much more diluted and mini form. On the broader side, definitely we have what you call a multipolar, a decentralized world polity, and which is united together as a global world polity thanks to the technological advances. The question is, does this make the world safer? Does this make the world safer? We may not have a third world war, but does this make the world serene, peaceful, safe, so that all of us can pursue our economic development? Because the smaller countries of North Africa and even India still has a lot of economic goals and economic challenges which they need to face. The world is still dying of hunger. So many of these areas need to be attended to, which could be if the politics moves in a different way from merely talking in terms of war, peace and nuclear arms or fundamentalism, terrorism. All these things need to be faced if some parts of the world has to really become hunger free, and every section of the population in those particularly fundamentalist countries under the fundamentalist regime, particularly the women and the children, have to enjoy the liberties which others have. So with that point is still leaving us with a question mark. So you still have points and problems and areas which need to be looked into, and the world has not yet become a one world, a one peaceful world as such. We have to wait. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for being the part of the EduSet lecture once again, and giving special inputs to this very lecture. Dear friends, with this we wind up our this session's lecture, but with this note we would like to congratulate you again on Digital India Week, which we are celebrating from today, that is 1st July to 7th July, and we would only say that let's enjoy the power of education and try to grab the maximum knowledge. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again.